So thank you again, everyone, for joining today. My name is Liz Williams, for those of you who don't know me, and I lead our Career Academies portfolio, along with my colleague who is here today as well, Long-Ki Vang. We are also joined today by a fantastic support team of Jasmine and Bridget. So thank you to that entire team for making today possible. As some of you know, those of you who have been involved with us in Career Academies for a while, and some of you who might be new, bringing people together in community is really a core part of the work that we do in Career Academies. And we are really excited today to debut today's Lunch and Learn format. The purpose of the Lunch and Learn is to introduce thought-provoking speakers and concepts related to career pathways and to spark conversation that inspires us as a community. So we hope that you leave today with a deeper understanding of who we are in Career Academies, a greater awareness of how public education and employment systems can advance systemic race equity. And we really hope that you're leaving inspired to lean into challenging conversations toward more equitable outcomes for young people today. And next slide. So for our time together today, we hope that you'll join us in setting a couple intentions for the day. So the first is to be present, however that looks for you. Some of us are in office, some of us are at home, but we hope that you can carve out this hour to join us and be present today. We also hope that you'll seek connections between what you're hearing today and with the work that you do in community. We hope that you'll lean into curiosity and that you'll commit to keeping the conversation going beyond the hour that we have together. So again, we are so grateful that you've all chosen to share your lunch hour with us. And at Greater Twin Cities United Way, our vision is a community where all people thrive regardless of income, race, or place. And we know the only way we can achieve our vision is to unite as change makers and develop solutions to address the challenges that no one can solve alone. Core to our work is bringing together change makers like yourselves. So again, thank you for being here today. Some of you may know United Way mostly as a grant maker to nonprofits, which really is central to our approach. But because of the other roles that we play in community across these 5 areas, we do sit in a pretty unique position. From this position, we're able to identify the gaps in systems that perpetuate inequity and fill those gaps by creating supportive innovation initiatives and community-centered solutions. Our innovation initiatives are time-bound strategies with the goal of accelerating sustainable change in our region and are developed through a process of listening to community members and experts in the field. And once we've identified an opportunity, we work to co-create strategies with our partners and to amplify and scale what's working. Career Academies is one of our innovation initiatives, and it was launched in 2015 to reshape how schools prepare young people for success. Guiding our work is the belief that all students are excellent and brilliant, and that for far too long, our education and employment systems have failed to live up to their promise, particularly for students and families of color. Our vision in Career Academies is to unite public education and employment systems so that all students in Minnesota have pathways to wealth building and purpose-driven careers. So we know our vision is bold and ambitious, but we are really encouraged by our progress so far and really excited to share what's to come. So we are developing a toolkit so that all of our partners, including those of you here today, have the resources to get started or deepen career pathways. Coupled with these tools, we'll continue to make targeted investments that strengthen career pathways across the state and support students with a real sense of urgency. We'll continue to provide technical assistance to our partners and build momentum to create sustainable change. And we know that even the most brilliant and passionate students, teachers, and communities really do need the right conditions to make change happen. So that's why we're also focusing our investments and efforts on critical issues through policy and advocacy. And lastly, we're continuing the momentum we've built in the last few years toward a statewide movement for career pathways. So we hope you'll continue to join us at convenings like today and stay connected for funding and learning opportunities as we build this movement together. So today's Lunch and Learn really is one of those efforts to build this movement. And as a convener and thought leader in career pathways, the Career Academies Lunch and Learn is intended to spark critical conversations and create a shared language for all of us, whether we're educators, employers, or administrators, and to make good on our intention to disrupt inequity and provide students with opportunity and access. So I am really thrilled to introduce Clair Minson today, and I'm not sure if anyone heard me introduce her the first time or if this is the second time, but either way, we're thrilled to have Clair here. Clair is an experienced nonprofit professional with a decade of experience in workforce development and mental health counseling. And since 2017, Clair has focused on the intersection of racial equity and workforce development, examining the manifestations of systemic and institutional racism in workforce policies, practices, and cultural messaging. Clair is a nationally sought after speaker, trainer, and workshop facilitator. And Clair came recommended to us by multiple different experts in the field. So Clair, we are just so thrilled to have you here today.
So Liz did the intro, Clair Minson. I'm really excited to be here and share what has been a growing kind of analysis in the work that I've been doing. And so we're gonna ground in some norms and in a discussion around what it means to have a fruit and root analysis to this work. And then I'll share some tools, 2 tools specifically that you can use as you're engaging and thinking about what it means to use this particular analysis to the work. And I'm using that language very intentionally. So I'm framing this as adopting a fruit and root analysis to address systemic inequity and seed transformational change, which was in the language, the invitation that you all received. And so before we get started, and because I can't spend a whole lot of time doing this, I want to add to some of the kind of intentions that were set already, but just by recognizing a few norms that I think, or naming a few norms that I think are really helpful in doing this work is one is recognizing that we all hold a particular point of view, and our point of view is shaped by our experience. And so recognizing that we're coming to this conversation from different experiences, different backgrounds, whether personal or professional or a mix of the two. I don't know that we'll have opportunities maybe in questions. Some people may use question reflection time towards the end of discussion, but I encourage you to use I statements when we have that time. And I statements really allow you to center your own experience rather than speaking in generalities. Connected to that, and as people engage in the chat or offer their reflections in the chat and potentially at the end during Q&A, really making sure that we are owning our intent and our impact. It's really important that we recognize that as much as intent matters, impact is equally, if not more important, right? Making sure that we are not causing harm, and when we do, we offer repair for that harm is really important to this work. And then last but not least, because we're talking about issues that were created over hundreds and hundreds of years and generations that we accept and expect non-closure, we will not solve systemic inequity in this 1 hour, 45-minute discussion today. Nor will you probably in the 30 or 40 years of your work experience, but you can plant seeds, you can lead change now. And so we have to accept and expect non-closure, and I'm offering that as another norm as we move into this discussion today. So I'm just going to dive into some grounding. I never like to assume that we all have the same definition of equity. We are well versed. I heard someone say recently, we are well versed in the language of equity. We as a field have become really comfortable in using diversity, equity and inclusion, racial equity, even anti-racism for those who are really ready to engage in that level of conversation, right? But I never want to assume that we're on the same page. And so the analysis that I use and the definition that I use in doing this work is that equity is both a condition and a process. So as the condition, it's the outcome. It's the outcomes that we want to see in our society, right? It's the reduced disparities, it's the closed wealth gap, it's you name the disparity and the outcome that you want to see as a result of doing a process that is guided by equity and racial equity principles and practices, right? So those two things together, equity is those two things together, working together, then we would see that the identities assigned to historically oppressed groups would no longer act as the strongest and most powerful predictor of how one fares in life, right? So identity would not be a predictor of life outcomes if equity were achieved. In order to do that, and using this definition, we recognize equity as one part of justice work. It is that root causes of inequities, not just the outcomes, not just the manifestations, which are the disparities that we see, or the fruit on the tree, if you look at the image, not just the manifestations would be eliminated, right? So it means that we would have a fundamentally different way of actually moving through our world. Our policies would be fundamentally different. The practices in our organizations would be fundamentally and transformatively different. The attitudes that we hold, the beliefs that we have, the mental models that we have, the cultural messages that we share, which are the stories and the narratives about people and challenges and issues in our society, would be fundamentally shifted and changed if we were doing equity with a root cause analysis. And so that definition was equity generally, and I want to speak to racial equity specifically. And the only difference the only difference in the definitions is that racial equity is specifically centering racial identity, right? So we would be looking at racial identity would no longer, based on data, be the strongest predictor of how one fares. In a previous definition, we were looking at a much more explicitly intersectional and historical identity categorization, right? So that could include, and typically includes our Native communities and individuals and groups who have been historically oppressed in the US broadly and generally. Racial equity specifically is centering racial identity, recognizing that in the construct of America, with racism as a core root issue and a core way of functioning in our society, that we have to start with and center race. And so, like the equity definition, when we use this term, we are thinking about racial equity as one part of racial justice. And you'll hear this definition multiple times. Repetition helps us to remember what it is that we're doing. But so this work would include root causes, right? So not just working at the manifestation, not just looking at access, not just looking at closing disparities, but also looking at workplace culture, also looking at public policy and legislation and making sure that those are have deeply embedded equity principles in them and equity-oriented outcomes. And in particular, we would change the way that we tell stories about people and challenges. And so in order to do the work, as we've defined it, which is looking at root causes, we have to look at what the root cause is. And I've mentioned this already, but I want to talk about essentially 5 root causes, 4 of them, 5 levels of racism, 4 of them on the screen and the next on the next screen. I think this is really helpful to understand that at the root cause level, these 4 levels of or expressions of racism are constantly happening every single day in every single interaction as we move through our society. So the personal level, personal racism, or sometimes you may have seen individual racism or internalized racism. These are the private beliefs and prejudice that individuals have and hold. This is what we believe inside, whether we tell people or not. And whether it's conscious for us or not, these are the personal beliefs that we have that are impacted and influenced by living in a racialized society, right? Where racism is a driver and it is a part of how our society functions. At the interpersonal level, that is where our private beliefs then interact with other people, right? So when we interact or choose not to interact with other people, that's the interpersonal level of racism. That happens whether we're in a workplace setting, whether we're in our home, or whether we're out in the world, right? So our personal beliefs then impact the way that we interact or choose not to interact with other people in our circle or outside of our circle. And then if we move to the institutional level, these are the discriminatory treatment policies and practices within organizations and institutions, whether conscious or not, whether explicitly stated or not. These policies can be quote unquote race neutral, meaning they have no racialized language in the policy, but they yield a racialized outcome, meaning they impact different racial groups within an organization differently and negatively, particularly for people of color. And so looking at recognizing that we are individuals with our own beliefs, and then we take our beliefs and we interact with other people, and then we go to workplaces and institutions. And so those interpersonal interactions show up and they interface with the institutional policies that either uphold discriminatory practices or seek to address them. Right? So that's institutional racism. And these are how these levels are working together. And then we have the structural level, which is where the umbrella is the way I like to think about it, right? This is the hardest level of racism to see. It's invisible largely, and its invisibility maintains its power. And so this is the system in which public policies, so big P, legislative policies, federal, state, local level, institutional practice, so we just talked about institutional, and the other norms such as cultural racism, interpersonal racism, personal racism, all work together to perpetuate racial group inequality. These 4 levels are constantly at play. And so if we're going to do root cause work, and we're going to think about, like, yes, we must pay attention to the manifestations, to the outcomes, we also must work at the root cause level. We understand that racism is happening at these 4 levels all the time. Then our work has to work across for all 4 levels at all the time. And recognizing that we may be in different places in our organizations and in our institutions and in our lives personally, we may not be able to work at all four, but we have to have a consciousness about which level we are working on and through which level we are disrupting, which level we are attempting to address in our work. The fifth one that I wanted to identify is cultural racism. And so this refers to representations, messages, and stories. These are narratives, right? And as nonprofit organizations or school partners or educators and trainers, there are stories that we use to enhance our work. We tell the stories of the people that we support. Sometimes, though, those stories and the national narrative, particularly around people in communities of color, is not always helpful. Sometimes it's harmful. And so cultural racism is the way that stories are used to reinforce ideas about who's better, who's normal, who's othered, who's excluded. So we see this in media, right? In video media, in print media, we see this in stories that our nonprofit partners tell. We see this in a lot of different avenues and modes. But cultural racism is really insidious and is really important to name because it influences collective beliefs about what constitutes appropriate behavior, what is seen as beautiful, and the value placed on various forms of expression, right? So we are going to do root cause work as it relates to equity, then we have to recognize that cultural racism is insidious, is pervasive in our society, and a part of our work has to be narrative change, and I'll talk about that as we move on. So I want to name, when I mentioned condition and process when I gave you the definition of equity, but I like to kind of narrow this down to bare minimum. If there's nothing else you remember or take away, this is what I want you to remember. Racial equity work requires you to do a few things, and these are like bare minimum what it requires you to do. This is your process. This is your how you think about doing this work. So one, it requires that you understand the racialized history and context, current impact of systemic racism on communities of color in the US, and not to lump those communities of color in one group, but to really take time to understand how has it impacted Black and African American individuals, how has it impacted Native in communities, how has it impacted Hispanic and Latina communities, right? How has it impacted Asian and Asian American communities? Really understand what is the history of racism in this country broadly. From there, depending on where you live, right? And we're focusing on Minnesota. I'm in Colorado now, but I used to live in New Orleans and it was in Maryland. It requires an understanding of the racialized history of your city, state, and region. So when I was in New Orleans, it was important for me to understand that Louisiana was the home of separate but equal. So how did that history of separate but equal play out in the interactions of people, right? In the belief systems of people, in segregation in housing and discrimination in industry? When I was in Baltimore, which is the birthplace of redlining, how did redlining impact the way that we maneuvered and navigated in Baltimore, right? So think about Minnesota's history. How does that history then impact your work, right? From there, you move to understand the racialized history of your industry. So now we think about pre-K and 12 or post-secondary and employment systems. What's the history of racism and how it's manifest in those industries and then in your company specifically? From there, start working on how does racism show up or manifest in our organization, so in those policies, in our interactions at the interpersonal level, and in conversations with people. From there, looking at, and this is not necessarily in order, although you can take it in order, but this is not meant to be, you start here and move all the way through, but understanding how talent systems in particular, right? How have education and employment systems been used to intentionally exclude people of color, workers of color, students of color? Then you want to disrupt and interrupt racialized norms, right? So the ways in which language and stories show up that reinforce beliefs about who's superior and who's inferior. Interrupt those in your conversations, call people in, ask for moments to pause and say, wait a second, you use this language. Can we get clear on what that means or who you're referring or what you're implying, right? Even if you're not saying. Critically examine every policy, practice, belief, and narrative through an equity lens. That means you're walking through this, what's the historical context of this policy? What's the intended or unintended consequences? Who's going to be impacted? Who actually was involved in the conversation and the design of this policy or this practice, right? Or this culture of the organization. Really, really important, again, committing to narrative change work, because racism is reinforced and inequity is reinforced, the language that we use and the stories that we tell. We have to be really critical and intentional about committing to narrative change work. So changing the way that we tell stories, for example, moving from an individualized framing, right? This individual is broken, to actually shifting a recognition that the system has been designed to produce outcomes for certain groups of people. And that's a very different, the onus is on somebody else. The onus, it lands in a different place when we move from an individual frame to a systemic frame. So when I talk about narrative change work, that's an example. And then last and certainly not least, intentionally and authentically engage historically and currently excluded communities. And you will see me often using historically and currently at the same time, because I never want you to think that because I'm naming historically that it's not happening currently. The historical impacts are still manifesting today, and there are new manifestations of racism that are happening today that are driving and supporting and upholding inequitable outcomes in career pathways. So I'm always going to name those two together. So what is this fruit and root analysis? So I was doing a presentation with a group and working on a project. Some of you may know the folks at Jobs for the Future and the Building Equitable Pathways project, and supporting some of that work. And looking at that image in the very first slide of the definition of equity, it just illuminated. And we're looking at a tree. Sometimes we use that image and we look at the boxes, but I'm going to encourage you using this image to look at the tree. And you can see at the tree that there are roots, and you can see that there's rotting fruit on one hand, and you can see that there's thriving fruit on the other. And so we are going to do the work of racial equity. We recognize that it's one part of racial justice. So I'm moving from my left to the right on the screen. We recognize that that means that we must eliminate policies, practices, and cultural messages and harmful narratives. It means then that we have to work at both the fruit. So we must pay attention to the outcomes that we are hoping to achieve, while also looking at what is happening at the root. So those 5 levels of racism: personal, interpersonal, institutional, structural, and cultural. Working at those 4 levels will make sure that we are impacting the root. So you all can see the root, which is really what feeds and ultimately produces the fruit, the kind of fruit that you see on the tree. So if we're working at the root, we're pulling up the weeds, we're dismantling and disrupting harmful narratives, then the hope is that we can see thriving, fresh fruit that we're ready, that we can eat and take, right? But if we are not working at the root level, we are going to continue to see the disparities in access, the disparities in outcomes, and ultimately yield rotten fruit, right? We will not see a transformed and equitable society. Another way to think about this fruit and root analysis, and this is a figure that was pulled from GARES, which is the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, the Racial Equity Action Plan Toolkit, is to think of it in this transactional and transformational approaches. You have to do both pieces of the work, so don't get me wrong. You must work at the fruit level, so you must work on increasing access. You must work on making sure folks are educated and ready and have access to the particular employment and educational pathways. And you must work at that fruit level, right? Organizational culture, interpersonal dynamics, power dynamics, et cetera. Another way to think about this is the transactional approaches, right, will yield some fruit outcomes, but those are issue-based. Those are helping individuals negotiate existing structures. Those solutions transact with institutions, and there are short-term gains for communities, but they leave the existing structure in place. And that's predominantly the work that we've been doing for a number of years, is helping individuals, whether we name it or not, negotiate maybe existing structures and systems. A transformative approach, or a root cause approach, would cut across multiple institutions, which is why this conversation is really important, because you're cutting across multiple ecosystems, multiple systems, right? K-12, post-secondary, and employment systems. You're focusing on policy and organizational culture, so you got to change the written policy, but also the lived culture of an organization, the lived experience of an organization. You alter, transform the ways that institutions operate, and you shift cultural values and political will to create racial equity. And so sometimes fruit and root has been easy for people to kind of hear and absorb, but another way to think about this is transactional and transformational approaches. You have to do both pieces of the work. Predominantly, we've been focused in that fruit or that transactional level, and where we're working at the individual or the immediate need level, but we have to do both. Otherwise, we will not see or realize a racially equitable society. And so I pulled together, I know it's a lot of words on the screen, but I'll walk us through this. I pulled together this example to help us think through, like, what does this actually mean or look like in day-to-day life or in our work? And so if you look at the kind of yellow box area, examples of race neutral framing, I want us to look at both at these 4 levels of racism. Personal, interpersonal are together. In the yellow box, we see these perceived root causes, and this is where our narrative change work is. In the green is where we will really get to addressing the true root causes. And I'm naming that intentionally because there is a narrative that some of the challenges that individuals and people of color in particular are navigating are because of their own individual choices and circumstances. That is a perceived and a false narrative. The true narrative is that there are systemic challenges, there are biases that people hold that prevent individuals from advancing and or even accessing opportunity, right? Whether it's education or employment. So in our perceived root causes at the personal, I'm just going to focus on the personal and impersonal level for both of these boxes for time's sake. You will have this handout. I know it'll be dropped in the chat and shared following. At the personal and interpersonal level, currently, and predominantly the way that we've talked about people and challenges is from a very race neutral framing, right? So it ignores the role that race plays in outcomes for individuals, the role of race and racism specifically. So the problem or the manifestation here is that there's a long-term unemployed Black man who's seeking training from a nonprofit organization, or maybe he's a student in your program, right? In your institution. The dominant narrative then in an instance like this is that the individual is unemployable or lacks skills and clothing for his industry of interest, right? So we seek to work on the individual and this individual problem. And therefore, from this framing, the solution that we offer is that this individual should change their clothing, they should change their speech, they should increase their interview skills and technical skills, and then that person will be employable. And while those pieces may be necessary, that's only one part of the story, albeit a harmful part of the story if we continue to reiterate it without looking at the structural and root causes. So if we shift over to the personal and interpersonal, where we have a racial equity framing, and the problem is still the same, right? The manifestation that we see is that there's an unemployed Black person who is seeking support, training or education support from your institution or organization. If we look at the root cause at the personal and interpersonal level, we will recognize that individual and interpersonal biases in the hiring and interview processes have limited this individual's ability to secure employment or access to higher education, right? If we look then to the solution, we will say the hiring managers and interviewing teams are then required to participate in equity and implicit bias training, as well as complete individual learning plans for ongoing learning on issues related to race and racism. So with our racial equity framing, our root cause framing, we're not blaming the individual and we're not seeking only to change behaviors in an individual, albeit education may be necessary and interview skills may be necessary, but that isn't a root cause, that's a manifestation. The root cause is really where in our hiring processes and the people who are doing the hiring are there biases that are negatively impacting Black people, Asian people, Hispanic, Latinx, Native and Indigenous peoples, right? And there, your solution is then to work with and provide training for the individuals who are in that hiring process, who are recruiting, who are interviewing, who are then making the offers. So that's one example I wanted to share and kind of highlight this race neutral framing, which has a perceived and albeit mostly false root cause, primarily blaming the individual. And then the difference between having a racial equity framing that really looks at root causes at this interpersonal, recognizing the role of bias and the role of racism in access and outcomes for people. And we'll have time for questions. I have a few more slides that I want to show you. So I've given you some grounding. I've talked about what this fruit and root analysis, definitional grounding. Here's this fruit and root analysis. And now I want to give you two tools. There are 4 slides here, but 2 tools that can support you in the development of a fruit and root analysis. This may not be second nature for you, but it is a skill or a muscle that you can build and develop. And like building muscles, it requires daily, consistent practice and exercise, not once every month. Well, you could do it once every month, but it'll take you much longer to build that muscle. So I want to reiterate that. So this is a tool that I helped develop when I was working in Baltimore called 10 Essential Questions for Workforce Development. And don't let the language, workforce development language, cause you not to see how it can apply to maybe your K-12 settings or your post-secondary settings, right? Think of it from a practitioner lens. So this was really created to help practitioners move from that universalist or race-neutral framing that we just heard in the example to designing programs and practicing from a racially equitable place. And the 10 questions are really serve as a way to, as a primer to help practitioners ask questions that center racially equitable outcomes and the reality of race and racism in the lives of the individuals you're serving and supporting, right? So I'm questions 1 through 7, and this is a tool that will be shared or has already been shared in the chat. Question 1 through 7 focus mostly on programmatic elements, and then questions 8 through 10 move from programmatic to operational and organizational, societal, and employer relationships. So a few of the examples of the questions, and at the header is 10 essential questions for workforce development and broadening that to education and training practitioners, because these are applicable and they help you move beyond the surface level race neutral framing and approach to program design and implementation, to really thinking intentionally about what are the racial impacts or outcomes that are going to be the result of these programs. So question 1 says, how is an equity lens incorporated within the program design, including recruitment and outreach, training and curriculum design, retention and tracking mechanisms? And so to make that a little plainer, when we think about how is an equity lens incorporated within the program design, it means that you're holding what I told you in that checklist, right? Which I said I shouldn't call it checklist, but for ease of communication, how are you factoring in the reality of race and racism and discrimination in your community, in your city, state, and region, in your program design? How are you factoring in the reality of race and racism and discrimination in your industry of focus as you design your training curriculum? And how are you thinking about the impact of race and racism and discrimination in employment and places of employment in your retention and tracking mechanisms? So when it says, how is an equity lens incorporated, think about that list that I offered to you, and like, how do you hold those realities in your mind as you're designing programs and you're thinking about recruitment and outreach? So if you're living in a segregated city where bus transportation is challenging, then that should influence, and so therefore limiting the number of individuals of color who may have access to your training or to your location, then that should influence the way that you design your recruitment and outreach efforts, right? Where are you strategically thinking about going into communities because of that have been segregated by housing and transportation? The third question is, has the program considered the racially disparate impact that applicants' selection criteria can have on applicants? So for example, have you thought about, have you looked at the data on the number of Black individuals in your community that have a GED or a high school diploma? Have you looked at the data on the number of Hispanic or Native individuals with criminal backgrounds in your community? And if you understand that data, yet you still have that criteria in your program design and your educational design, then how is this criteria reinforcing exclusionary outcomes for those individuals who may not have a high school diploma or a GED, who may have a criminal background and thus cannot access your educational programs? So how do you think about the ways that your criteria may reinforce and lead to or continue to support racially disparate outcomes? So for example, I ran a maritime training program, and we had a criminal background requirement because that's what the industry had, but it meant that every month when we had a recruitment fair, we were turning away at least 50% of the people. So we were reinforcing the cycle of no in the lives of individuals who are already struggling to gain access to education and workforce and employment training. So how is your criteria reinforcing potentially, whether intentional or not, those disparate outcomes and leaving people excluded? And then question 5, will the program have a positive impact on racial and ethnic equity, inclusion, and full participation of all people in the process, in the implementation, in the breadth of outreach and participation, in decision-making and culture of decision-making? That's a huge question. I'll break it down. Will the program, just the first part, will the program have a positive impact on racial and ethnic equity, inclusion, and full participation of all people? How do you know that as a result of people participating in your career pathways training or your education training or your employment training, that there will be a positive impact on the societal level and full inclusion and participation of those individuals in society? How will you know that there's going to be a positive impact, right? Think about the outcomes of your training. And beyond just the way that we typically think about it, who got a degree, who got a job, but what's the long-term generational impact positively for those communities as a result of participating in your program or your educational opportunity? The second, so that was the first tool. The second is this racial equity theory of change, which is a much more involved and comprehensive tool, but it really gets to the root cause in a way that I haven't seen a whole lot of other tools do. A few things about it is a 5-step primer for tackling community problems that are marked by chronic racial inequities. And another way to think about it is a backwards mapping process, which is another, root cause analysis are typically backward mapping processes. I'm really distilling these processes and this analysis down in a way that I think is bite-sized and kind of easy to understand. This tool uses a structural race analysis, means recognizing and understanding that policies, systems, institutions, and cultural messages uphold racial inequities. And so those are the primary areas that this tool is going to ask you to focus on. Again, root causes, 5 levels of racism, right? You see that structural race analysis. And then what it offers is a visioning methodology, encouraging change leaders to investigate their implicit and explicit assumptions about the attributes of the community level outcomes they seek. And so when you're done with the racial equity theory of change, this is kind of the map or the flow chart that you'll see. And I have an arrow here by this kind of third step. So step 1 is identifying your desired racial equity outcome. So if there are particular disparities in the career pathways in which you're working in, then you name, using data, you name the outcome that you want to see. We want to see an increase in students of color by 15% or whatever that data, whatever the disparities in the data is telling you, then you establish a goal, a racial equity goal from there. And then you identify, like, what are those building blocks or what are those conditions that absolutely must be in place for us to achieve and maintain this desired racial equity outcome goal, right? Like there might be some concrete things that just have to be in place in order for that goal to be achieved and maintained. This big chunk in the middle, public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, that's your root cause work. And this is where people usually stop in this exercise, having done this with a few communities. This is where people get stuck because it requires you to move beyond the fruit, right? The outcomes, the data and the disparities to really examine what are the public policies in our community that will support our racial equity goal and what are the public policies that will hinder us from getting to this goal? What are the institutional practices that will support our racial equity outcomes and what are the institutional practices that will get in the way and hinder us from achieving that? And then what are the narratives? What are the stories? What are those cultural representations that are helpful or supportive to our goal? And what are those narratives and stories and cultural representations that are really harmful that we must address? That is your root cause work. That's not working at that 5 levels of racism. And then in this process, then you move from there to look to really a mapping, a stakeholder mapping of like who has power in your community, where do they sit, how often do they meet, who has access to them, where are the possible sources of retrenchment. So in this work, we know that people will push back. You know that there will be people who will not want to move this work forward, or organizations and institutions. A part of this requires you to be honest about who those are. That's your root cause work. Who are the people that are going to get in the way, that are going to oppose? Who are the people who don't understand and maybe just need training? And who are the people who absolutely don't care what you say, will not get on board, right? Being clear about that so that you can develop a strategy to move forward, which is that fifth step, assessing your organizational capacity and then thinking what's the role that you can play to get to this desired racial equity outcome. So it's a much more comprehensive process and outcome, but I wanted to highlight that kind of step 3, that public policies, institutional practices, and cultural representations as a way that you can really dig deep into root causes and try to address and develop strategies to address those.
Claire, thank you so much. And I can, while folks are thinking, and I really encourage folks to speak up or enter into the chat if you have questions or just, you know, what's resonating with you, like Claire said. I think one of the things that I'm really curious about in your work, Claire, is that in the Lunch and Learn today, we have folks who are, the crux of their work is really cross-sector partnerships. And I think that these conversations often happen, especially in education, like in our office or at our school, you know, in a best case scenario, they're happening at our school, maybe at our district. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to what, you know, moving some of this thinking can look like through cross-sector partnerships from your experience.
Yep, that's a really good question. And some of what is typically required in equity work is having shared language, right? Common values and shared language. So in cross-sector partnerships is like, what's the language that we're using? How are we using it? Making sure that we're using it in the same way. So after you've developed your common and your shared language, then really establishing your values. Do you have shared values? Do you both believe in equity? If you don't, then it might be a non-starter. If you don't and a partner is willing, then how do you walk along the journey and be clear about walking along that journey? A huge part of it is transparency. So I'm doing some work locally with building and fostering regional collaboration. And a part of it is really understanding how to have meaningful and transformative relationships. And so we saw that transactional and that transformational approaches. Well, there's a piece of that that applies to relationship building as well. In transformational relationships is reciprocal, right? You're looking for the win-win-win. You're trying to make sure that there's mutual respect. There's reciprocity in the relationship. And then most importantly, in transformational relationships, when there's tension, it serves as a catalyst for more growth and transformation in the relationship rather than a breakdown in the relationship. And so you're really looking for shared values, particularly as it relates to equity and positions on equity and racial equity. And then you're looking for kind of alignment of values and commitment and willingness to move along the journey, willingness to engage in uncomfortable or hard conversations, to assess the partnership regularly and often and honestly, and then evolve, continue to do work and evolve as you go. It's not easy work. It is long-term work, but it's not impossible.
Thanks, Claire. I think we've been given some tools today that, you know, the hope around shared language is that today you've given us as a community some tools to start from. Thanks everyone for being here today. We'll have our next virtual Lunch and Learn not until this spring. So we hope that you'll mark your calendars for Tuesday, March 14th, where we will be bringing in another fantastic speaker. So stay tuned for that. Also put on your calendars that we will be launching our second year of our purpose-driven paychecks RFP in January. And so that is a funding opportunity to support school and business partnerships. And then lastly, Claire mentioned this, but we do have a discussion guide. So for those of you who are in the chat asking about sort of what comes next for you, please reach out to us. I think Lanki, if you want to just pop your email address into the chat, reach out to Lanki and ask for the discussion guide, and we will get that over to you as well. That will be separate from the materials that we send out after the event. But thank you everyone for being here today. This was fantastic. Thank you to Claire. And we hope that everyone has a great rest of your day and safe travels if you're out there on the snowy roads. Thanks everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.